In the West, Osamu Tezuka is almost exclusively defined by his foundational figures from the 1950s, specifically Astro Boy and the bulbous-nosed Professor Ochanomizu. Parallel to these works, Tezuka spent 34 years writing an ambitious science fantasy epic called Phoenix. It was a project of immense scale, eventually spanning thousands of years and multiple lifetimes. The core of the series creates a unique narrative friction. Standard storytelling relies on a beginning and an end, markers that do not exist for an immortal bird of fire. If a character lives through the birth and death of the universe, a straight, linear timeline cannot accurately represent its reality. To solve this, Tezuka moved away from traditional serialization. He began organizing the individual story arcs into a specific physical arrangement that reflected the Phoenix's perspective rather than a human one. By the time he was finished, the publishing order of the volumes functioned as a simulation of reincarnation itself. This structure operates like a pendulum. Tezuka started the series by swinging to the extreme edges of human history, intending to slowly work his way inward toward the middle. The first volume, Dawn, is set in the deep past, focusing on the rise of ancient civilizations and the early human desire to conquer death. The very next volume swings to the opposite extreme. Future takes place billions of years later, at the literal end of the universe. In this distant era, humanity has abandoned the surface of a dying Earth to live in subterranean cities. Life is governed by massive supercomputers that have begun using genocidal logic to manage the dwindling resources. A pilot named Masato is granted immortality by the Phoenix, only to realize he is the sole witness to the planet's slow, silent extinction. He is left to contemplate the next billion years in total isolation. By claiming immortality as a psychological burden rather than a gift, Tezuka subverts humanity's oldest fantasy. This era was later expanded in the 1980 film Phoenix 2772. It visualizes the future through an atom-punk aesthetic, characterized by sleek, high-modernist architecture and psychedelic color palettes. The film uses this setting to examine human failing, depicting an elite class driven by political greed and a reckless desire to blindly exploit the Earth's mantle, even as the surrounding environment completely collapses into ruin. Amidst this decay, the film centers on a romance between a space pilot and a robot named Olga. Their connection suggests that in a society stratified by eugenics and algorithms, empathy is found in the synthetic rather than the ruling class. But the grandest thematic statement is found back in the original manga's timeline, which eventually reveals a structural pivot. At the very end of the Future arc, the universe dies and restarts, linking the absolute end of time back into the absolute beginning. The line becomes a circle. Because the timeline is a loop, the stories of ancient conquest and future collapse are no longer isolated events. The structure implies that the greed and environmental destruction seen in both eras are part of a cycle humanity is destined to repeat. As the published volumes continued to alternate between past and future, the temporal gap between the two era paths steadily closed. Tezuka intended for these two paths to eventually meet at the top of the circle in a final volume titled The Present. He spoke about this final arc as his own concluding act, stating that he wanted to draw the final chapter of The Present at the exact moment of his death. In 1989, Tezuka passed away before the timelines could converge. His life's work stopped abruptly here, in the modern era of a busy Tokyo street. However, this lack of a final volume actually supports the story's circular design. A completed circle requires no ending. The unfinished loop allows the narrative to cycle through its past and future indefinitely. While the Phoenix represents a bird that can never be caught, Tezuka's arrangement of the volumes achieved something similar. By building a story that feeds back into itself, he created a work of art that can simulate eternity, even after the artist is gone.